Life had not been easy for the single father. He was a man who woke up every morning before the sun rose, making sure the little lunchbox on the kitchen table was packed, the school uniform was ironed, and the shoes were polished. Every day began with small acts of love for his son, even though his own heart carried a heavy weight. Years ago, tragedy had changed everything. His wife, the boy's mother, was no longer with them. She had been his partner, his best friend, and the glue that kept the little family strong. When she was gone, he was left standing in an empty house that once echoed with laughter and warmth. Suddenly, the walls felt colder, and the nights became painfully long. But in the middle of that darkness, there was one light that never dimmed: his son. The boy was just 7 years old, full of innocence and questions about the world. Every time the father looked at him, he found a reason to keep going. Even when his body was tired and his mind overwhelmed, that little smile gave him strength. The father worked long shifts to pay the bills. His hands were often rough, his back sore, but he never once complained. Whenever someone at work asked how he managed, he would simply smile and say, "I have someone waiting for me at home." That was the truth. No matter how hard the day was, the thought of returning home to his son made it all worthwhile. At night, after dinner, the father would sit with his boy and listen to him talk about school. The child stories were always filled with excitement: who ran the fastest at recess, what drawing he made in art class, and how his teacher told him he was doing better at reading. These little talks filled the father's heart with pride. He knew he wasn't perfect, but he tried his best, and in his son's eyes, he was enough. Still, being a single parent wasn't easy. There were moments of loneliness, moments when the silence of the house after his son went to bed felt too heavy to bear. He would sit by the window, staring at the streetlights, wondering if life would always feel this way. He didn't think much about love anymore. That part of his life seemed locked away, as if it belonged to someone else, someone from a past he could never return to. But deep down, even if he didn't admit it, he missed companionship. He missed sharing simple conversations at the dinner table, someone asking him about his day, someone who understood the struggles of being a parent. Still, he had promised himself that his son would always come first. If there ever was another chance at love, it had to be with someone who respected and cared for the boy as much as he did. The little boy noticed his father's efforts too. He would sometimes say, "Daddy, you're the best," in the most genuine way. Those words were like medicine to the father's heart. He didn't need riches or recognition from the world. All he wanted was to raise his boy in a home filled with love and honesty. Every morning, as they walked to school, the boy would hold his father's hand tightly. That bond between them was unbreakable, built on years of shared struggles and countless small moments of joy. The father never allowed himself to cry in front of his son, but in the quiet hours of the night, he sometimes wiped away tears, missing the life he once had but feeling grateful for the life he still held on to. He believed his purpose was simple: work hard, raise his son, and keep moving forward. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. For the father, that surprise was waiting just around the corner. At that moment, though, he had no idea that someone new would soon enter his world, and with her arrival, everything would change. The days passed quietly for the father and his little boy. Their routine rarely changed: morning walks to school, long hours of work, and evenings filled with homework and simple dinners. Life was steady, but it was also lonely. The father never complained, yet deep inside he felt something missing, something he didn't know if he would ever find again. One weekend, everything began to shift in the most unexpected way. A close friend of the father invited him to a small community gathering. At first, he refused. He thought, what would I even do there? He wasn't the kind of man who liked parties or social events anymore. But his friend insisted, saying, "You need a little break. Just come, bring your boy if you want. It will do you good." Reluctantly, he agreed. That evening, as he stood among familiar faces and a few strangers, he noticed someone across the room. She wasn't trying to draw attention, yet something about her presence was warm. She had a gentle smile, the kind that felt genuine, not forced. She spoke softly with others, laughing at small jokes, and there was a calmness in the way she carried herself. They were introduced by his friend. Her name was Emily. She was polite, kind, and had a way of making conversation feel easy. For a man who had spent years hiding behind silence, that small talk felt refreshing. They spoke about simple things at first, the weather, their community, and work. But then the conversation began to go deeper. She asked about his son, and when he spoke about the boy, his whole face lit up. Emily noticed that sparkle, the pride in his voice, and it made her respect him even more. The father wasn't looking for love. In fact, he wasn't even sure he remembered how to welcome someone into his personal life. But there was something different about Emily. She listened, really listened. She didn't rush his words, didn't interrupt, and never made him feel out of place. As the evening ended, Emily smiled and said, "It was nice talking with you. Maybe we'll see each other again." Those words stayed in his mind for days. Back at home, life continued as usual. Yet, when he laid in bed at night, her face crossed his mind. He wasn't used to these thoughts anymore, and he almost felt guilty for having them. He wondered if he was even ready to let someone new step into the world he had built so carefully for his son. But fate has its own way of pushing people forward. The next week, he ran into Emily again, this time at a grocery store. It felt like a coincidence, but in his heart, it felt like more than that. They chatted briefly, and before they parted, Emily said, "Why don't we have dinner one evening? I'd love to meet your son." At first, his heart raced. Inviting someone into his home was not a small step. His son was his world, and he had promised himself to protect that world fiercely. But something in Emily's voice felt sincere. She wasn't pushing. She was simply opening a door. That night, he thought long and hard about it. He remembered the loneliness he often felt, the silence of the evenings after his boy went to sleep, the quiet dinners where only the ticking of the clock kept him company. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to try. A few days later, he found himself dialing her number. His voice trembled slightly as he asked, "Would you like to come over for dinner?" "Nothing fancy, just a simple meal." "It would mean a lot if you met my son." Emily's cheerful, "I'd love to," made his heart feel lighter than it had in years. The following days were filled with a nervous kind of excitement. He cleaned the house more carefully than usual, made sure the dining table looked welcoming, and even cooked a meal that took extra effort. His son noticed the change and asked, "Daddy, is someone coming?" The father smiled softly and said, "Yes, a friend. I want you to meet her." The boy tilted his head curiously, but didn't ask further. He trusted his father, and that was enough for him. When the evening finally arrived, the father found himself pacing near the window, waiting for the sound of a car pulling up outside. His son sat quietly at the table, curious about the visitor. And then the doorbell rang. With a deep breath, the father opened the door to see Emily standing there with her warm smile, holding a small basket of fresh bread she had baked herself. "I thought I'd bring something," she said kindly. For the father, that small gesture meant the world. It wasn't about the bread, it was about the thought, the effort, the sincerity. He welcomed her inside, his heart hopeful but also nervous. At that moment, he had no idea that this simple dinner would turn into a memory he would never forget. For what happened next would leave him standing in silence, stunned by the very words of his own little boy. The evening felt calm, and the soft smell of home-cooked food drifted through the house. The father tried to act normal, but inside, his heart beat faster than usual. He wanted everything to go smoothly. He wanted his son to feel comfortable and for Emily to see the little world he had built so carefully. Emily stepped inside with a warm smile, carrying the basket of bread she had baked. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "I love cooking, and I thought this might go well with dinner." The father thanked her and guided her into the living room where his son was waiting. The little boy sat quietly, his feet barely touching the floor as they dangled from a chair. Usually, when guests visited, he was cheerful and curious. But this time something was different. The moment his eyes landed on Emily, his entire body froze. His playful expression vanished. Instead, his face turned pale, and his eyes grew wide as though he had seen something unexpected, something he could not believe. The father noticed immediately. "Daniel," he said gently, "this is Emily, a friend of mine. She's here to have dinner with us." The boy didn't respond. His small hands tightened around the edge of the table. He looked from his father to Emily, then back again, as if his mind was trying to make sense of what was happening. His silence filled the room with a tension that neither the father nor Emily had expected. Emily tried to ease the moment. She smiled kindly and bent down a little so she could look him in the eyes. "Hello," she said softly. "It's so nice to finally meet you." But Daniel didn't smile back. He swallowed hard, and his lips parted as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the courage. His father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, buddy?" That's when the boy finally whispered, his voice trembling. "Daddy, she's my teacher." The words struck the father like lightning. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. His eyes darted to Emily, searching for some kind of explanation, while his son's small, frightened voice still echoed in his ears. Emily's face turned red, and she quickly lowered her gaze. She hadn't expected this either. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence grew heavy. The father, still shocked, asked his son carefully, "What do you mean, she's your teacher?" Daniel nodded nervously. "At school, she's my teacher. She teaches my class." His voice was shaky, but there was no doubt he was telling the truth. The father turned to Emily, his mind racing. "How could this be? How could I not have known?" Emily finally spoke, her voice gentle, but filled with a hint of embarrassment. "Yes, he's right. I am his teacher. I recognized him when I walked in, but I didn't know how to say it without making things awkward. I'm so sorry. I should have told you right away." The father didn't know what to say. 1,000 thoughts rushed through his mind. He had invited her here, thinking she was simply a kind woman who wanted to share a meal. But now, everything felt complicated. He glanced at his son, who sat stiff and quiet, his little chest rising and falling with nervous breaths. It wasn't just surprise in his eyes. It was confusion. He wasn't sure how to process the fact that the woman standing in their living room, smiling kindly just moments ago, was the same woman who stood at the front of his classroom every morning. The father knelt down beside his boy. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "You don't need to be scared." He stroked his son's hair gently, hoping to calm him. Emily stepped forward, her voice tender. "Daniel, I know this feels strange. I didn't mean to surprise you. At school, I'm your teacher, but here I just wanted to be your dad's friend. Nothing changes in the classroom. I promise." The boy looked at her carefully, still unsure. His small fingers fidgeted in his lap. The father could feel his son's hesitation, and part of him felt protective, like he should shield the child from this sudden change. Yet another part of him saw the sincerity in Emily's eyes. She wasn't trying to hide anything. She had simply walked into a situation that none of them expected. The father stood up slowly, trying to gather himself. "Well," he said in a calm voice, "this is surprising. I didn't expect this. But maybe we can all sit down, have dinner, and see how it goes. What do you think?" The boy didn't answer right away. He looked at his father, then back at Emily. After a long pause, he gave the faintest nod. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. Emily smiled softly, relieved. "Thank you, Daniel," she said kindly. "I'll do my best to make this evening comfortable for you." They all moved to the dining table. The food was served, and though the atmosphere wasn't as relaxed as the father had hoped, the evening slowly began to find its rhythm again. Emily spoke gently, keeping her words light, while Daniel listened quietly. The father tried to bridge the gap, guiding the conversation and encouraging his son to feel at ease. Still, deep inside, his heart was unsettled. He wondered what this meant for his son, for himself, and for the connection that was just beginning with Emily. What had started as a simple dinner had turned into something none of them would ever forget. And in that moment, the father realized that life had thrown them into a situation that was both complicated and meaningful. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The dining table was set, the food warm, yet the air carried a heaviness no one could ignore. The father kept glancing at his son, then at Emily, still trying to piece together the strange twist the evening had taken. A part of him wanted to laugh at the coincidence, but another part of him felt a storm of questions rising inside. He never thought that the woman he had just begun to open up to, the woman who made him feel a spark of hope again, was the same person standing in front of his son's class every morning. It felt unreal. The boy, Daniel, sat quietly, pushing his food around with his fork. His usual chatter was gone, replaced with a silence that seemed too heavy for someone his age. He kept glancing at Emily, then quickly looking down again, as though he wasn't sure if it was okay to see her in this new light. Finally, the father leaned forward and spoke gently. "Buddy, I know this feels strange, but Emily's still the same person. She's just here for dinner with us." Daniel looked up, his eyes serious, and whispered again, "She's my teacher." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. It was as though he was trying to remind his father of something important, something he wasn't sure his dad understood. The father nodded softly. "I know, and that's okay." Emily placed her fork down carefully and folded her hands. Her voice was gentle, filled with honesty. "Daniel, I want you to know something. At school, I'll always be your teacher first. That will never change. But tonight, I'm here because I wanted to know your dad better. I didn't expect this surprise, but I promise you, I would never do anything to hurt the bond you both share." Daniel's eyes shifted between them. His young mind was still trying to untangle what this all meant. Teachers were supposed to live in schools, in classrooms, not show up in kitchens, eating at the same table as you and your dad. It blurred the lines of the safe, little world he knew. The father reached out and gently touched his son's shoulder. "I understand this feels confusing," he said softly. "But sometimes life surprises us. Emily is someone I trust. And if you give her a chance, you might see that she cares too." For a moment, the boy didn't respond. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Will she treat me differently at school now?" Emily shook her head immediately. "No, Daniel. Never. In class, you'll always be my student, just like everyone else. Nothing will change there. And here, if you're okay with it, I'd like to just be a friend." Those words seemed to soften something inside the boy. He didn't smile, not yet, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. He picked up a piece of bread from the basket she had brought and nibbled on it quietly. The father let out a small breath of relief. He knew this was only the beginning, that it would take time for his son to adjust. But he also knew Emily had spoken with sincerity, and that mattered more than anything. Dinner continued slowly. Emily shared a few light stories, careful not to overstep. She asked Daniel about his favorite hobbies, his favorite foods, and even his favorite cartoon. At first, his answers were short, almost guarded. But as the minutes passed, his responses grew a little longer. When Emily laughed softly at one of his jokes, something shifted. For the first time that evening, Daniel allowed himself to smile, just a little. The father noticed it and felt his heart lighten. Yet deep inside, he still carried questions. Could this work? Could he really let someone into their lives who already played such an important role in his son's world? It was risky. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the feeling that fate had placed Emily in their path for a reason. After dinner, as the dishes were cleared, the father offered Emily a cup of tea. They sat in the living room while Daniel played quietly with his toys nearby, his ears still tuned in to their conversation. The father finally broke the silence. "I have to admit this caught me off guard." His voice was calm, but his eyes revealed the storm inside. "I wasn't expecting this." Emily nodded. "I know. Believe me, I didn't either. When I saw Daniel, I recognized him instantly, but I didn't want to make things uncomfortable for you. I thought maybe if I just let it flow, it would work itself out." She sighed softly. "But I should have been honest the moment I walked in." The father shook his head gently. "You didn't do anything wrong. This situation is just unique." He glanced at his son, who was building a small tower with his blocks. "The most important thing for me is his comfort. If he feels uneasy, then everything else has to wait." Emily's eyes softened. "I understand completely, and I respect that." Their voices lowered, but Daniel caught enough to know that his dad was trying to protect him. That simple realization made him feel safe. His father always put him first, and nothing about that had changed. The evening drew to a close, and Emily prepared to leave. As she stood by the door, she looked at Daniel with a gentle smile. "Thank you for letting me come over tonight. I know it was a surprise, but I really enjoyed spending time with you both." Daniel hesitated, then gave a small nod. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was a sign that he wasn't closing the door completely. When the door closed behind her, the father sat beside his son on the couch. He pulled him close and whispered, "How are you feeling?" Daniel leaned against him quietly. "It's weird," he admitted, "but she was nice." The father kissed the top of his head. "That's all I needed to hear. We'll take it one step at a time, okay?" And in that quiet moment, father and son sat together, the weight of the evening slowly settling. The shocking words that had frozen the room only hours earlier now began to fade into something else, a complicated but hopeful beginning. The night after Emily's visit lingered heavily in the father's thoughts. Even after his son had gone to bed, he sat quietly on the couch, staring at the dim light of a lamp. He kept replaying the moment when Daniel froze, the way his small voice had whispered, "She's my teacher." He couldn't deny it. He was shaken. He had opened his home and heart to the possibility of something new, and fate had answered in the most unexpected way. It wasn't that Emily was unkind. On the contrary, she had been patient, respectful, and warm. But the father couldn't help but wonder if this coincidence was a blessing or a complication. The following days at home were quiet. Daniel didn't bring up Emily, but his silence about her spoke louder than words. He still went to school every morning, holding his father's hand on the way, but now the father found himself wondering what it must feel like for the boy, seeing his teacher in class, and then realizing she had sat in their kitchen. It blurred the lines between school and home, between the two worlds Daniel trusted to stay separate. One afternoon, the father received a message from Emily. It was short, thoughtful, and honest. "I know things were unexpected. If you're comfortable, I'd like to explain myself. Not as a teacher, but as someone who respects you and your son. Maybe coffee this weekend." The father stared at the message for a long time. A part of him hesitated. He wanted to protect his son's world. But another part of him remembered the look in Emily's eyes, the sincerity in her voice, the way she had tried to reassure Daniel instead of brushing his feelings aside. That mattered. So he agreed. They met at a quiet little cafe on Saturday afternoon. Emily was already there, sitting at a small corner table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. She smiled when he walked in, though there was a trace of nervousness in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. He nodded and sat down. "I thought it might be better to talk." For a moment, they sat in silence, the clinking of cups and quiet chatter around them filling the air. Then Emily leaned forward, her voice calm but steady. "I want you to know something. When I met you at the gathering that night, I didn't see you as a student's father. I saw you as a man who was kind, hardworking, and dedicated to his child. That's what stood out to me. It wasn't until I stepped into your home that I realized who Daniel was." The father listened carefully. Her words were plain, but there was honesty in them. Emily continued, "I didn't say anything at first because I didn't want to make the evening uncomfortable. But when Daniel recognized me, I understood how big of a surprise it was for him. And I know trust is fragile. I want to earn both yours and his, step by step." The father sipped his coffee slowly, weighing her words. "My son means everything to me," he said firmly. "His comfort, his happiness, that comes before anything else." "I wouldn't expect otherwise," Emily replied quickly. "And I don't want to step into his world in a way that confuses him. At school, I'll always be his teacher first. That won't change. But outside of school, if you let me, I'd like to just be someone who cares about you both." There was a stillness in her tone that made the father pause. He realized she wasn't just saying words to sound nice. She meant them. For a moment, his heart softened. He thought of all the nights he had spent alone, the silence in his home once his boy was asleep, the weight of carrying everything by himself. Maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe life was giving him a chance to open a new door. They spoke for a long time that afternoon. Emily shared a little about her own life, how she loved teaching, how she admired the way Daniel was being raised, how she respected the strength she saw in single parents. She didn't pry, didn't pressure, just listened and shared in return. When the father returned home later, Daniel was playing with his blocks on the living room floor. The father sat down beside him, and without being asked, Daniel looked up and said, "Did you see her today?" The father was surprised. "Yes," he said gently. "We talked." Daniel thought for a moment, then asked softly, "She said she won't treat me different at school. Is that true?" "Yes, buddy. She promised. And I believe her." Daniel nodded slowly, as though he was trying to process it all. Then, after a pause, he whispered, "She was nice the other night. I just didn't know what to do." The father smiled and hugged his son. "I know. It was a big surprise. But we'll figure it out together. No one's going to change what we have." Hearing those words seemed to comfort the boy. He leaned into his father's arms, trusting him completely. From that moment on, things began to shift slowly. Emily didn't rush. She gave Daniel space. At school, she treated him no differently than any other child. At home, she was careful, respectful, and patient. She knew trust wasn't built overnight. It was built through small moments of honesty, kindness, and consistency. And little by little, Daniel started to see her not just as his teacher, but as a person outside the classroom. Someone who laughed at his silly jokes. Someone who brought homemade cookies just to see him smile. Someone who made his father's tired eyes look a little brighter. The father, too, began to see a change in himself. The loneliness that once weighed on his shoulders began to feel lighter. He realized that maybe the shocking words his son had spoken were not meant to scare him, but to open his eyes. Life had given them a twist they never expected, but maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was the start of something deeper, something that could heal wounds none of them talked about out loud. That night, as he tucked Daniel into bed, the boy looked up and asked, "Daddy, do you like her?" The father smiled softly. "Yes, I do." Daniel thought for a moment, then whispered, "I think I do too." And with those simple words, the walls between them began to fall, one piece at a time. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, and in the weeks that followed, what once felt like a shocking twist slowly became part of their everyday life. The father, who once carried loneliness like a heavy coat, began to notice little changes in himself. He laughed more. He looked forward to evenings instead of dreading the silence. And when Emily visited, the house didn't feel so empty. It felt alive. Daniel, too, was changing. At first, he remained cautious, unsure how to separate Miss Emily, the teacher, from Emily, the friend. But children have a way of adapting, and Daniel's heart was more open than he realized. One evening, Emily came over with a small gift, a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook, knowing how much he loved to draw. At first, Daniel looked at the gift with hesitation. But as he flipped through the blank pages, imagining what he could create, a smile crept onto his face. "Thank you," he whispered shyly. Emily smiled back. "You're welcome. I can't wait to see what you'll draw." That moment was small, but to the father, it felt huge. It was the first time he had seen his son accept Emily not as a teacher standing at the front of a classroom, but as someone welcome in their home. From then on, things grew easier. Emily never blurred the line between her role at school and her presence at home. In the classroom, she remained firm and fair, treating Daniel as she did every other child. But after the school bell rang and the day ended, she became someone else, a kind friend who laughed with them, listened, and cared deeply. The father watched all this unfold with a mix of gratitude and awe. He had once believed that his story of love and family had ended the day his wife was gone. He thought his future would only be about survival, about keeping life together for his son. But life was reminding him that even in brokenness, there was room for healing. And even in endings, there were new beginnings. One Sunday afternoon, the three of them went to the park. It was something simple, just a walk among the trees and a chance for Daniel to play on the swings. Emily pushed him gently as he laughed, his feet kicking at the sky, his laughter ringing through the air. He hesitated, then said, "You've brought something back into our lives that I thought was gone forever. I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to know that I'm grateful for your patience, for your kindness, for the way you've treated my son." Her eyes softened. "And I'm grateful for the chance to know you both. You've shown me what real strength looks like." They didn't need to say more. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. That evening, when they returned home, Daniel surprised them both. As he set his shoes aside by the door, he turned to Emily and said, "Are you staying for dinner?" Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Only if it's okay with you," she said gently. Daniel grinned shyly. "It's okay." The father's heart swelled at that small moment. His son's acceptance meant everything. It wasn't just about Emily being part of his life. It was about Emily being welcomed into their life. Dinner that night was filled with laughter and small jokes. Daniel showed Emily his latest drawing, a sketch of their little family. Himself, his dad, and surprisingly, Emily too. The father's eyes misted when he saw it, though he quickly looked away, not wanting to embarrass his son. Later, after Emily left, Daniel curled up beside his father on the couch. "Daddy," he whispered, "I like when she comes over. It feels nice." The father kissed his son's forehead and held him close. "Me too, buddy. Me too." And in that moment, he knew something important. The walls of his heart were no longer locked. Life had given him an unexpected twist, but it was one that opened the door to love, trust, and second chances. From then on, the house didn't feel as lonely. The laughter of a child mixed with the warmth of new beginnings. The shocking words that once froze the room, "She's my teacher," had transformed into the foundation of a story that was no longer about loss, but about hope. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for a single father who had once thought his world had ended, this was the start of a brand new chapter.